All right, good evening, all. I'm Kate Schmidt, and I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for Orange County, New York, since we have a lot of folks from not in this area, as well as a land use planner at Orange County Department of Planning. For the sake of all the folks on this call tonight, we ask you to keep your devices on mute. We will open up the floor to all comments and questions at the end. But please, we ask you to put your questions as we go along in the chat box. Okay, we're just gonna mute that. You can come over here and admit me on the other side, please. All right, so again, if we could put ourselves on mute, that would be fantastic. We will open up the floor to questions and answers at the end, but we encourage you to please put your questions as you go along in the chat box. We will try and help you as we go. We have 5 very wonderful people here that's going to be able to answer most of your questions. And if not, we'll find you an answer. And if you want to share information in the chat, if you want to share links, remember the chat box is an exchange of ideas waiting there. So, and sometimes you learn more in the chat. So we all can learn from each other. So please use the chat. Remember that this session is being recorded, and the recording, as well as all the slides, will be available on the Orange County website, specifically on our sustainability page in about a week or so. And that address is orangecountygov.com/sustainability. And I'll put that in the chat. Lastly, some of our folks always ask about credits, and credits can be granted for your attendance in this class, but it is up to your municipality if they will honor them as part of New York State mandatory planning and zoning board official training. With that out of the way, welcome to so many climate acronyms, the wrong one's coming off my tongue. Welcome to Climate Solutions Week. We had 2 other webinars this week: how to manage food scraps and extended producer responsibility. Both of them will live on our website as well, if you'd like to check them out. But for right now, I want to introduce our wonderful speakers tonight. We're going to start off with Haley Carlock, who is the Director of Environmental Advocacy and Legal Affairs at Scenic Hudson. Scenic Hudson is a Poughkeepsie, New York-based nonprofit environmental organization founded in 1963 to save the iconic Storm King Mountain. It's on the west side of the Hudson River, about 50 miles north of New York City. And it's credited with launching the modern environmental movement. They wanted to put a utility plant there. So electric generation, I should say, plant. So this was great that we were able to save it. I hope all of you can come one day and look how beautiful it is. Haley has extensive experience in environmental, energy, and land use law, and leads Scenic Hudson's advocacy and legal programs. She uses tools including litigation, advocacy, and grassroots coalition building to protect the Hudson Valley communities and natural resources and accelerate New York's transition to clean energy. Haley co-chairs the Energy Committee of the New York State Bar Association's Environmental and Energy section, and was named to City and State's New York Energy and Environmental Power 100 list in 2021. Please take it, Haley.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. It's great to see so many folks interested in this topic, one that, though many of us have been working on this a long time, it's somewhat of an emerging field, and it's just great that so many people are interested in learning more. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. Please, if there's any issues with the screen share, just put it in the chat. Kate gave such a wonderful introduction to Scenic Hudson. There's really not much more I can say about us, except that this is a photo of the iconic Storm King Mountain that back in the early 1960s, Con Ed thought was, a perfect place for a large-scale power generation facility. But we saved it, and we're still going strong, based in Poughkeepsie, just across the river from Orange County, which is the focus of our discussion today. But what I would love to say about Scenic Hudson that Kate didn't get to is that over the past 5 to 7 years or so, our organization has had an increasing focus on climate change and mitigating climate change. Specifically, we have a goal of rapidly transitioning the Hudson Valley to a sustainable, low carbon region, powered by renewable energy, while also protecting and preserving all of those invaluable resources, both natural resources and community resources that make the Hudson Valley such a very special place. So what is driving solar development in New York? Taking a step back here to talk about, why is solar such a big issue? Why are we seeing so much solar development? Why are we having this webinar? Why is it such a big topic? So first and primarily, we have state policy driving what we're seeing here in the Hudson Valley. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed in 2019 and set a number of goals, but most importantly, I think for our discussion here today, the act requires that 70% of New York's electricity be generated from renewable resources by the year 2030. And believe it or not, it's almost 2023. So that is creeping up very quickly, and we are nowhere near 70%. So we're really going to have an enormous ramp up of renewable energy resources over the next 7 years. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act also set a goal of having 100% of New York's electricity generation be carbon-free or zero emissions by 2040. Now, carbon-free or zero emissions is a little bit broader than just renewable energy, but still, you can understand what a huge transformation this is for New York State's electric system. So every year, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, issues large-scale renewables solicitations, trying to seek large-scale kind of grid utility-scale projects that act in a similar way to the typical like fossil fuel-fired power plant that you might be familiar with. Through that, it incentivizes those large projects, about 25 megawatts and larger. And in fact, there was just the most recent solicitation announced by Governor Hochul last week, I think, as part of Climate Solutions Week, for 2,000 more megawatts of solar. And in addition to those large kind of utility scale projects, we have in New York, the New York Sun program, and that focuses on distributed scale solar, which are those smaller projects, not like the solar panels right on your house or that maybe directly serve your business, but the 2 to 5 megawatt projects that instead of going to the statewide distribution, the statewide transmission system, focus on more local distribution and are, of course, smaller size. And we've also got some federal policy, fortunately, now that is also driving some of this development. The Biden administration has a goal of 100% carbon-free energy by 2035, so even a little bit more aggressive than New York's goal. And as part of re-entering the Paris Agreement, we have a national pledge of a 50% reduction of GHG emissions from 1990 levels by 2050. And last but certainly not least, it's been a hot topic lately, certainly the recent Inflation Reduction Act provides a large financial investment in renewable energy, and New York could be the beneficiary of some of those funds to help us reach our clean energy goals. So where is the intersection of solar energy and agriculture? And unfortunately, I think when a lot of folks think about solar and ag, the first thing that might come to mind is the conflict between them or the potential conflict between them. So farming and solar energy production share a lot of the same characteristics in terms of what kinds of land are best for them. You need large flat areas. You need areas that are cleared or at least mostly cleared of trees and shrubs, and you need areas that are sunny. That's ideal for farming. It's also ideal for solar. So you can see why the agricultural community sometimes might be concerned that there's a lot of development pressure from solar developers because it's such an ideal spot for solar. And again, there is some concern from some agricultural advocates and farmers about the loss of farmland that could result from solar development. I do want to pause here, though, and say that, as I think most people on tonight's webinar probably know, New York has unfortunately been losing farmland for a very long time, especially smaller family farms, and especially here in the Hudson Valley. And that's, not because of solar development, but it's because of a lot of other factors. So the idea that, solar might be coming in and being put on some farms sometimes, makes people nervous. They say, we're already losing so much farmland. Why do we have to lose more for solar? But the good thing is that great opportunities exist for strategically combining agriculture and solar on the same land, kind of a win-win solution to get benefits from both, the food production that is happening on the land, as well as the clean energy production. And that can serve, of course, to meet both agricultural preservation goals and renewable energy goals. Agrivoltaics specifically, which is clearly the topic of our conversation here, you might hear a few differing definitions. I don't know that there's one perfect, totally agreed upon definition of agrivoltaics. I know there's not one in New York state law, but I'm sure there are ones that industry has been using. So we think of agrivoltaics as being what you call dual use. So agricultural activities and solar energy production maintained simultaneously on the same piece of land. So in the same place at the same time. You are growing crops, or perhaps you have livestock grazing, and on that same land, you are also having solar panels sited and producing energy. So again, a real win-win solution. There are other ways that agriculture and solar can be combined that I just want to mention briefly that may not necessarily fall into, the definition of agrivoltaics, which are putting solar on parts of farms that are not currently in agricultural production. So for example, I've worked on a solar development where the farmer is leasing about a third of their land that they find to be marginal in terms of its production to a solar developer. And they're using the income from those lease payments to help them to continue to farm the other 2/3 of their land. So the solar is happening in a different place than the agriculture, but is providing an essential benefit to the farm. And the quote that I always go back to from that farmer is that if we didn't have the income from the solar, I wouldn't be able to hold on to this farm. This is what's enabling me to stay in operation. There's also on-site solar to support the agricultural use, so to power the equipment, power the buildings that are on-site. And then there's also pollinator-friendly solar. So you can plant pollinator-friendly and native crops that can both help on a specific farm if you have pollinator dependent crops, but also more broadly really help support biodiversity and soil quality well beyond the farm itself. So there's a great ecosystem benefit there as well in terms of pollinator friendly plantings. So the benefits of agrivoltaics include increased land productivity. You're really getting the maximum productivity you can from that land. It gets that income diversification for farmers. If there's a bad year, a bad crop, a bad slew of years, you've got that steady income from leasing for solar. There's a level of protection against drought and heat that the shade from the panels can provide. And I think we can't forget also that it helps increase public support for solar, to see that you can have these multiple land uses at one time. If a community sort of self-identifies as being an agricultural community, a farming community, being able to continue that while also having solar energy is going to be more appetizing for folks in that community. So Scenic Hudson developed a How to Solar Now toolkit, we call it, that is meant to support stakeholder decision-making in the interest, again, of accelerating renewable energy development in a smart way here in the Hudson Valley. So it includes a suite of tools. We have our solar siting guide, first published in 2018, that has 10 principles set out for smart solar siting. And you can see there that even back then we were recommending dual use and co-location on ag lands. We have our solar zoning guide, including best practices and recommendations on how communities should actually implement solar zoning to allow that development to occur in the right places. And again, we have some recommendations relating to aligning agricultural protection policies with solar development. And I'll talk more about the zoning in a moment. And last but not least, and we're going to stay on this topic for just a moment, we have our solar mapping tool, which is really cool, I think. It's a web-based interactive tool that combines mapped information with education and guidance to help communities proactively plan for smart solar energy. So obviously one of the things focused on in the tool is agricultural resources, and we have several data layers for agricultural resources to support that planning and zoning process. And I do just want to mention that over the next few months, we will be updating the tool to include as data layers New York State identified mineral soil groups 1 through 4, which are what New York has deemed sort of the most productive and best soils. Right now in the tool, we use the federal NRCS categorizations of prime if drained. And because the New York State programs and incentives are using those mineral soil groups, and that's also what state agricultural tax assessments use, we want to be aligned with that. And so we'll be adding those layers over the next few months. I'm just going to give a Oh, and there's the web address for howtosolarnow.org. I'll drop that in the chat as well. You can go in, check it out. The mapping tool itself is super easy to use. If I can use it, hey, anyone can use it. Just going to go over at a very high level how our tool works and give you a glimpse of that before I talk more specifically for a moment about zoning and planning specifically for agrivoltaics. So we have a 4-step planning approach that we advocate in our tool. First, of course, is assessing patterns of existing land use and resources. What do you have in your town? Do you have a lot of forest? Do you have a lot of ag land? Is it very densely developed? See what you have in your community and where those things are located. Find those opportunities. Find spots where you might want to put solar, a large enough parcel, an area that you think would sort of go with your comprehensive plan and the land uses in your community, and identify those locations that avoid the most negative impacts to valued resources as you and your community define those. And then finally, last but very much not least, evaluate solar feasibility, which is a really important step, which is you don't want to zone for solar or plan for solar in an area where nobody's ever going to develop it because, you know, maybe there's no transmission nearby. Maybe there's no way to hook into electric infrastructure. Maybe the slope or the aspect ratio of the site is not ideal for solar. So that's our overall planning approach. And then you can go through and look at data layers to kind of identify how those intersect and how solar may or may not be compatible with them. As you can see there, right in our tool, we have a nice sentence that says that agriculture can coexist with solar on the same property, which ensures the benefits of both. And this is just a screenshot from our tool. This is the town of Clinton in Dutchess County. And of course, you could zoom in. And you can see the agricultural layers there. As I said, currently the tool uses prime farmland, prime if drained, and farmland of statewide significance. However, we will be transitioning to using those mineral soil groups over time. But our guidance and our education that goes along with the mapping tool is consistent in saying that solar should be allowed when appropriate on farmland. That's a decision that needs to be made, of course, by the municipality, but there are a lot of benefits that can be achieved by combining agriculture and solar. And want to talk for a moment specifically about zoning to promote agrivoltaics. And I love this first quote here. This is actually from a pretty recent research paper. And, you know, based on my own experience, I agree emphatically that local land use policy is the most significant catalyst or inhibitor for agrivoltaic development. And what I found working with communities across the Hudson Valley is that many of them, and I think unintentionally, have essentially zoned out agrivoltaics. You know, there's no way that somebody could develop an agrivoltaic project and be compliant with a community's solar zoning. And then communities are always confused when this happens because that certainly wasn't their intent. So overly strict and inflexible land use policy related to energy siting on farmland is a barrier to achieving agrivoltaics and all of those co-benefits. And zoning that is instead permissive of solar on farmland can establish a good regulatory environment if it's done correctly. In New York State in particular, local law is super important to enabling agrivoltaics for those smaller projects, less than 20 megawatts, the community scale as they're called. They are subject to local land use and environmental review. Almost all of the decisions about where and if that project's going to be sited are at the local level. And so having the zoning that permits that is essential. And even for those larger projects, those grid scale projects that are subject to a state process, and there's not a lot of direct local approval or input in that, those must comply still, even though it's a state approval, they must comply with substantive local law unless those laws are quote unquote unreasonably burdensome, which is a topic unto itself. But the fact is that having that zoning that allows it, you know, zone for it and they will come. I think that's kind of like axiomatic when it comes to local zoning, and it's true for agrivoltaics as well. And then we have 3 sort of recommendations here in order in terms of what a community should provide for if they're looking to zone for agrivoltaics. The first is to be sure to separately define and permit agrivoltaics as a specific land use. The second is to permit in agricultural zoning districts and others where farming is permitted. A lot of communities tend to zone solar only in industrial districts, feeling like, oh, then maybe it'll like be further away from people, you know, it'll not impact our other land uses as much, but that prevents agrivoltaics from being constructed. And finally, allow for flexibility in design. This is also something we're seeing. In order to successfully have an agrivoltaic project, oftentimes you see that panels will need to be taller. Still not as tall as a single family home, but taller than like the 10 or so feet that typically solar will be installed at. And that's so that you can allow for crops to grow beneath, you can allow for livestock grazing, but sometimes communities, in an effort to make sure visual impacts are minimal, put a hard stop on the height of the solar panels, which in turn does not allow agrivoltaics to be constructed. So those are just a few recommendations in terms of how communities can start to zone and plan for agrivoltaics. And that is it for my presentation. My contact information is there. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or would like to follow up on something. And I will stop sharing my screen so that we can go to our next presenter.
Thank you, Haley. That was wonderful. Next, we have Ethan Winter. He joined the American Farmland Trust in 2021 as its first full-time Northeast solar specialist. In this role, Ethan is building on AFT, American Farmland Trust, regional leadership in advancing smart solar siting strategies and cross-sector engagement to develop best practices for agrivoltaics and regenerative farmland management on solar projects. Previously, Ethan was a project developer and senior community engagement manager with Cypress Creek Renewables. And while with Cypress Creek, he led community outreach strategies and helped to secure zoning approvals for over 100+ megawatt portfolio of community distributed generation projects in New York and Massachusetts. Prior to working in the solar sector, Ethan led the Land Trust Alliance's flagship New York program for 13 years, managing the New York State Conservation Partnership Program and expanding a statewide network of land trusts, developing climate mitigation initiatives and advising on state policy recommendations for siting large-scale renewable energy development. Ethan has served on the City of Saratoga Springs Climate Smart Task Force and is on the board of the Adirondack Council. Please take it away, Ethan.
Thank you so much, Kate. Can you see my screen? I want to make
Yes.
sure I'm sharing. Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joining us this evening. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes about AFT's intersection in solar, and you'll hear some themes echoed from Haley's excellent presentation as well. And I think it highlights some convergence amongst organizations that are focusing on land protection and climate action, really thinking together about how solar can be an agent of good, including on farmland, but if we do that right. And I'm going to lead also on some context. Again, you'll hear some echoes from Haley's presentation on the context for solar in New York and Orange County, and that will lead to some smart solar principles that will tee up the Lightstar Renewables project. So how did AFT sort of get into talking about solar? We have 3 legs to our climate initiative, and they're probably not too surprising if you're really focusing on climate solutions, protecting the most important farmland, the most productive land. It's a key strategy. Agricultural lands will have an essential role to play in climate mitigation. So protecting the most productive land is a key strategy, and keeping growth compact, so we don't have runaway sprawl, is a key function of that strategy. AFT is also really involved in supporting best practices for farmers and moving agricultural practices to a more regenerative approach. And that includes, again, a real focus on soil health. And we think that that approach can work quite well within solar development. So thinking about the land on which solar is developed with a regenerative lens. I think you'll be hearing more about that from the Lightstar team. And finally, smart solar in general. We are really at this interesting intersection of thinking about food security, farm viability, clean energy, and how all these pieces are working together in real time. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the smart solar approach at AFT. The bedrock for AFT's work is a really detailed analysis of the most productive, versatile, and resilient farmland across the country. And we've created a formula or an algorithm that looks at each state's most productive farmland. And you can access this through our spatial mapper. It's a great resource. Scenic Hudson and other conservation groups have integrated this into their mapping platforms to better understand the nuances of farmland. And this goes several steps beyond just what's USDA prime to really understand the land that's most suitable for growing our food. And as Haley said, this is often land that's quite suitable for solar as well. And that's what leads us to this conversation around agrivoltaics. In 2020, AFT released a national report looking at each state's farmland trends. And nationally, we inventoried over 11 million acres of land, farmland that was converted to urban and high density development or low density residential development. And both of these are drivers of farmland loss in different ways. Again, what does solar have to do with this? It's interesting because when we did this analysis between 2001 and 2016, solar was a very weak signal in terms of farmland conversion. What we're going to see going forward is a much stronger signal from solar as we transition to really a solar dominated renewable energy grid. And so key theme that I'm raising here is how does solar affect these development and conversion trends? Is it additive? Is it neutral? Is it potentially beneficial in terms of preventing other forms of development? New York, in our Farms Under Threat analysis, lost 250,000 acres in that 2001 to 2016 timeframe. So just to give you some perspective. Historically, the drivers of agricultural land conversion are poorly planned development, challenges to farm viability, and increasingly that's high fuel costs, input costs, thin margins. We're seeing a huge generational transfer and challenges for new and beginning farmers to access land. This is probably as pronounced in the Hudson Valley as anywhere in the entire country. So many of you participating this evening are well aware of these drivers. And of course, climate change itself, whether it's droughts, floods, and erratic growing conditions, farmers are really on the front lines of understanding these challenges. And again, solar will represent a new form of land use as we transition quite audaciously from the current kind of power that we have to a solar dominated grid. And we at AFT believe that this can really cut in both ways here. Solar can be a form of poorly planned development. It could also be a way to prevent farmland from turning into houses. And if we're really integrating agricultural practices and soil health into our solar development, we are likely to see better win-win outcomes that keep farms in farming. And that's ultimately what our goal is here at AFT, is keeping agricultural land viable for the future. I wanted to just step back and think about how we overlay solar with our Farms Under Threat analysis. And again, it's kind of interesting to see the top 10 states for current installed capacity: California, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Virginia. And New York would actually be number 11, right behind Virginia. 8 of those top 10 states are in our highest threat category based on the Farms Under Threat analysis. So what that tells us is that nationally, and New York is in that high threat category as well, as solar is coming, it's happening largely in states that are already under stress in terms of farmland conversion. So this really heightens the need for state policies and local mechanisms to support farmland protection and solar deployment that doesn't displace agriculture. And that's exactly what we're kind of getting at with this concept of agrivoltaics through local permitting, local zoning, and state incentives that support that. We addressed this specifically in the Farms Under Threat 2040 report that we released in June of this year. And I'll make sure I add that link as I close here. If you were not able to attend this New York webinar that we did for Farms Under Threat 2040, that's available as well. We did a deep dive for all 48, lower 48 states, looking forward to 2040. What kinds of farmland conversion could we expect? And we modeled with 3 different scenarios. A business as usual scenario, looking at those trend lines from 2001 to 2016. We developed a runaway sprawl scenario and a better built cities scenario, where compact, smart growth prevailed, and we really redoubled our efforts to protect the best farmland. What we found in that analysis is that almost 12 million acres would be lost across the country through a business as usual scenario. We also did some modeling around solar. There's a section in the report that refers to the Department of Energy's Solar Future Study. This came out in fall of last year, and it estimates that in order for the country to decarbonize its grid and reach about 40 to 45% solar penetration, we would need 8 to 10 million acres of solar across the country, mostly in rural communities. That was a real flag for AFT, because 90% in rural communities to us means farmland. And DOE, to its credit, is thinking a lot about agrivoltaics and supporting research and funding for demonstration projects in this area. If you're interested in learning a bit more about the Solar Future Study, again, take a good look at the Farms Under Threat 2040 report. We've got a nice section there. Specifically for New York, in the Farms Under Threat 2040 report, the business as usual scenario indicates that New York could lose another 450,000 acres over the next 20 years. Again, that's both urban and high density development as well as low density residential development. That's equivalent of 2,500 farms and almost $300 million in funds. So one has to ask, how much can we really afford to lose? And what kind of impact does solar have on those background trend lines? I think it was, Haley mentioned the Climate Leadership and Protection Act, Community Protection Act. Within that, there is an estimate of 60 gigawatts of solar that will be needed in New York to meet its climate targets. And that includes the 100% fossil fuel free grid, emissions free grid by 2040. 60 gigawatts is equal to about, if all of that were ground mounted solar at 7.5 acres per megawatt, that's about 450,000 acres. So basically the same amount of land we're projected to lose through our Farms Under Threat report, basically doubling that impact. We know that over 80% of the land that's most suitable for utility solar is agricultural. So this is really screaming out, again, that we need strategies as we deploy more solar to not unravel our agricultural land base. And that leads really nicely to the Hudson Valley. Because of the way solar is going to be developed, primarily with community solar in the Hudson Valley, there will be some larger projects. We have some in Greene County, there's a couple in Columbia County and Albany County that are under development. But largely you're seeing community solar development. And this is a real opportunity for the Hudson Valley and Orange County in particular to be a leader in integrating agrivoltaics into community solar, keeping that farmland in production. This graphic from the Solar Energy Industry Association provides a visual on community solar as really being the kind of the key, one of the key areas in the capacity profile right now. That's the green in the chart here. But over time, the blue utility scale solar is going to be much more significant across the state of New York. Right now, again, community solar is kind of key part of the market, and we think this is a a very appropriate place to think about agrivoltaics because it typically fits on 20 to 40 acres, often on one farm or a portion of one farm, which allows for the farm to continue in operation. Last year, we did a survey of farmers across the state. We released this report in February of this year. We asked farmers to give us some feedback on what they would like to see in terms of mitigating the impact of solar on farming. And what we got from the survey was a really strong signal of interest in co-utilization, whether it was livestock under the panels, growing crops, or sheep, a pretty strong interest in seeing if this could work. And again, the real question is, how do we make this work in a way that's replicable and economical for project developers and the farmers on the ground? But this was a really important signal. We're doing a survey of farmers in Connecticut right now. It's also showing strong support among the agricultural community. So I think this is an indication of farmer interest. We just need to make sure that we have the tools and strategies to do this right. I'm just going to wrap up in a couple of minutes here, but wanted to highlight a couple of maps from our Farms Under Threat 2040 report. Maybe a little bit hard to see here, but the map on the left shows the land that's projected to be lost. And don't look specifically for tax parcels, just get a general sense of the red. That's what we're seeing as likely to be converted. And the map on the right shows how the farmland is distributed across the county. This is what we have to work with. In our report, we're really highlighting the importance of local permitting and local zoning that allows for, and explicitly permits agrivoltaics. To Haley's point, sometimes the solar laws inadvertently exclude this as an option. So really important to be thinking about how to enable this. We're also highlighting the importance of best practices in these local codes and highlighting soil health in the construction of projects and in decommissioning. The state of New York's Department of Agriculture and Markets has a set of guidelines that developers are well aware of, and many solar codes at the local level are adopting those as local requirements as well. So what might agrivoltaics look like in the Hudson Valley? These are examples of projects that are in operation right now around the country, using regenerative grazing with sheep, poultry in the southeast, intensive food cropping, and the project in the lower right is going to have cattle grazing. It's just been placed into service in the last few months. So there are a number of different possibilities for how you can integrate agriculture, whether it's cropping or livestock within these solar operations. The National Renewable Energy Lab has been paying a lot of attention to this, and there's a terrific new resource that is basically an analysis of different studies that have been done. And the conclusion is there are 5 C's to success in developing agrivoltaic projects. I won't read all of these in detail here, but I just want to highlight this as a key resource and focus on the bottom 2, compatibility and collaboration. In order for these projects to be successful, we really need a different mindset for how these projects come together. Thinking about how the landowner, the farmer, the community, the developer are working together for a long-term agricultural outcome that can really work for the land and for an agricultural market that it serves. So this is a really kind of interesting new approach, and a lot of interest, again, with both the federal agencies and with NYSERDA and developers like Lightstar Renewables to sort of see how we can make this happen. American Farmland Trust is also really eager to see this. And we have distilled our approach to the smart solar principles, 4 basic pillars here. And I just want to highlight that agrivoltaics is one of 4 key elements. It's not the only thing that AFT is focusing on, but it's a really important area. Of course, we're still focusing on prioritizing solar on the built environment as much as possible to minimize the impacts We want to, of course, protect soil health in everything that we do and promote equity and farm viability as a key cornerstone of this work. And that means inclusive stakeholder engagement, really bringing folks together to understand the best practices. So I give a lot of credit to Kate for pulling us together, because that's exactly what we're doing today. I'm going to just leave with a few resources here as I'm running out of oxygen. And I will cede the floor since I can't seem to speak anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Yes, Ethan's just getting over the virus, so we appreciate that he's still here with us. That was wonderful. You mentioned a lot of documents. I hope you can take a moment and share them in the chat, because these are all good things that we want to be able to follow up on, especially the Farms Under Threat 2040. Next, we have Ian Ward. He's the CEO of Solar Agricultural Services, also known as Sol Ag Bio. Ian is an experienced farmer with 2 decades of experience working with farmers as a USDA NRCS technical service provider, specializing in conservation planning. His work has been featured in NPR, Business Wire, Washington Post, and the New York Times. Ian has worked extensively with Ocean Spray, both as an strategic advisor and on the Grower Council representing Massachusetts grower owners. In addition to owning his own first-generation cranberry and livestock farm for 14 years, Ian has helped farmers with planning, conservation, and diversification across the United States and Canada. And as CEO of Solag, Ian leads a dedicated team trusted by both farmers and developers to be the liaison that understands the economic, environmental, and social dynamics of family farms. Ian's representation of farmers in solar development for the last 5 years, combined with 3 years of management and actual hands-on farming experience on some of the nation's first agrivoltaic projects, makes him and the Sol Ag team uniquely qualified to facilitate and effectuate the development and implementation of agrivoltaic projects. And I apologize, my laptop is not working with me today. Let me just finish the last. And he wants to remind us that when family farms disappear, the direct connection to our food source also goes away, and the small towns lose their rural character. Ian's mission is to implement regenerative systems and revitalize farmland. It went away again. The joy of the mouse pad, folks. So Ian is here to inspire us and get us back to where we want to be. Thank you, Ian.
Well,
And in between,
that's great. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here. And just to sort of explain, put this into context, I'm here with Lightstar, the Lightstar team, Lucy and Cami, who will be speaking about this next as well. And we can see how the combination of really the agrivoltaic world comes together, because there's a how-to element to this, and that's what I was going to talk about, focus on my presentation. But just to give you an idea, Lucy's regulatory compliance, and Cami is a director of development, and we are development manager, and we're working together collaboratively to introduce agrivoltaics to farmers, because this is we are breaking down the barriers. We are changing paradigms on both the agricultural side with farmers, the political side with legislators, the local regulatory side, solar developers themselves, because there's a change of paradigm of how business was done and how business needs to be tweaked for agrivoltaics to work. And then finally, the financial side, because if projects don't pencil out, they don't get built. And that's what we're seeing some of as well. So next slide, Lucy. What is agrivoltaics? I thought Haley did a great job defining what agrivoltaics are. Going back to the basics, it's just growing crops underneath solar panels. That's as simple as it is. And Steve asked a very good question. Let's talk about what that is. You have to sort of get away from conventional solar, thinking that these are black panels that are southerly oriented, fixed tilt, and there's 10 feet in between the panels. There's nothing wrong with that from a energy perspective. You can graze sheep in those areas, and those should be embraced to do that, to replace lawnmowers with sheep. But we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about incorporating bifacial panels to let diffuse light come in, raising the panels up a little bit, spreading them out a little bit. We're talking about single axis trackers, which are north-south oriented. So they track the sun east to west. And these are all elements to really work the soil, because from an agricultural perspective, you start with the soil, you start with the farmer, the soil first, farmer second, solar third. Even though the solar aspect of this is a driving force, if you look at this from a land preservation perspective, which is what it is all about, it's what American Farmland Trust also realizes, that we're changing our paradigm from going to being very small, let's minimize the impact, to let's kind of incorporate as much farmland as we can. Let's put that perimeter fence around as far off the field as we can to the tree line, so we're not impacting the agricultural function of that land. So we're coming back to the slide here. You know, we're talking about ways in which to incentivize a behavioral change. And there's traditional ways of putting money in the landowner's pockets as a lease payment, a very common thing. But what is another element that agrivoltaics adds is being able to afford a stipend to the farmer or to the tenant farmers themselves. Because at the end of the day, there's not a lot of farmers that are making a lot of money. A good income is not what the general population thinks is a good income. It is a way of life, and the goal of agrivoltaics, as far as I'm concerned, is making farming sexy again, bringing the next generation back. How do you do that? You can integrate really cool ways of farming into the process. So if we can pay a farmer a stipend, and that could be, instead of a lawnmower being paid for to mow that grass under the array, it could be the sheep farmer that's paid to mow the grass under the array. Add to that, thinking about vegetables or row crops, if a stipend is paid and the farmer's receiving, and multiple farmers, maybe 5 on a project, right? If there's a way to do that, which there is, there's a mechanism to do that, we've done it before, then all of a sudden you're passing the wealth. You're really combining energy sector money with agricultural sector know-how to combine things here. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you examples. This is Jack's solar garden. He's also a part of the Lightstar team, and it's single axis trackers. So they're 7 feet off the ground, spaced 21 feet apart on center to those posts. And there's 3 rows of vegetables being planted in between: raspberries, squash, beans, all kinds of things. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is an active, and I wanted to, I highlight the vegetables there, but this is not all about, that's a very good cash crop for smaller arrays, or for segments of the array. And this is the thing, we're changing the way that we're thinking about these. It's not all or nothing. It's not go big or go home. Even with utility scale solar projects, you can have compartments of them, segments of them. Maybe you take 5 acres or 10 acres. You do something different. Maybe you raise the panels up a little bit. Maybe you spread them out a little bit. Cornell is studying these things right now, as is UMass right now. If we can construct in New York, primarily, there's not an incentive like there is in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the first state in the nation to have the SMART program, which incentivized this kind of change. And it enabled people to think differently, enabled the first projects, this being one of them you're seeing here, be built because they're expensive. When you raise these panels up and you spread them out, there's less density, there's more steel. At the end of the day, it took an incentive to make it happen. There's an opportunity in New York, and I sort of right now, to authorize and to think through having an incentive so that it's not just one little component that is an experiment. Let's sort of adopt this as a means for the entire project or for a larger percentage of that project. So one to point out, if you can look at this, people question, can crops grow? Number one, are they going to die? Right? Grass grows really well in semi-shaded conditions. This is an example of just after the first cut of hay, the grass is actually growing better in the shade than it is in the sun. And there's about a foot different, maybe 8 inches off of those posts. The mower can get in there, the tedder, the rake, the baler. So those things can happen. Next slide, please. Here's another example. We've got a project that we're looking at in Grafton. We're planting lettuce. We're planting squash. This same sort of configuration. This is a fixed tilt. This is an early example of a project. Today, again, they're probably going to go single axis trackers. So again, we're innovating and we are looking at this from a farming first perspective. So we're getting the farmers' feedback. We're getting the feedback from what the photosynthetically active radiation results are telling us. So a lot of study here, but we're at the bleeding edge, as Ethan says, on the study. Now we're just taking there's a calculated risk being taken by all, financiers included, to build projects that can provide an example and that can be on the cutting edge of showing how we can do things differently here. Next slide, please. Can equipment fit down the arrays? Yes, it can. Whether it be a harrow or a rototiller. The goal here, and working with Lightstar is one of the priorities with that particular company, is to incorporate regenerative agricultural practices, right? If we can incentivize a change of behavior, a change of thinking from a 60-foot wide boom that we're spraying crops with to thinking a little bit smaller, more adaptive, can we integrate regenerative practices, which is basically just not rototilling and putting in strategically planting cover crops of legumes and things that fix the nitrogen. Again, soil first, farmer second. So incorporating the farmer's knowledge into these projects is key to them working. And then from a local permitting perspective, if you get the family and the next generation on board, it is contagious. It is contagious how excited farmers get when they give you the hairy eyeball first, when they're like not quite sure about this. A couple months down the line, they're calling saying, I have this idea. I want to grow mushrooms on it. I want to grow ginger on here. I think I can grow soy. This is what can work in New York. So as an example, I want to plant those seeds figuratively and literally with you. Next slide, please. Another example of hay at that same array. So what can you learn from these? And what can you take home from, if you hear nothing else? It's where there's a will, there's a way. You have to want to do agrivoltaics. You have to want to think outside the box. I think there's a tremendous opportunity from a carbon sequestration perspective, from a crop diversification perspective, and for the agricultural leaders to pay attention that we have an initiative from an energy perspective to get to our renewable energy goals. That's a massive goal. How can we get there while not losing farmland, while preserving farmland and preserving more farmland than losing? That is the opportunity with agrivoltaics. Next slide, Lucy. Very much looking forward to your questions later on. You can tell I get excited and start going. So looking forward to hearing them in the chat or at the end of the presentation. And that's all I've got, Kate.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian. That was wonderful. You remind me that a lot of discussions, there's only so much sheep milk and wool we could use. The solar's inevitable. So right now they're finally agreeing to put sheep in these places, but really food is, I think, going to be needed. So thank you. Next up, we have Cami Cohen from Lightstar. As a development manager at Lightstar, Cami manages the development phase of the community solar project life cycle. Cami works closely with landowners, electric utilities, authorities, having jurisdiction, community members, and consultants to ensure project development accounts for all stakeholder input and applicable laws and regulations, with the ultimate goal of helping steward the renewable energy transition as equitable as excuse me, I don't know. Prior to joining Lightstar, Cami was a project development manager at SunPower, where she developed community solar and behind-the-meter projects for public and private entities, spanning 5 years of experience in the solar industry. Thank you so much, Cami, for joining us tonight. Please take it away.
Kate, I'm actually going to introduce Lightstar first and then kick it over to Cami for the case study. So I am Lucy Bullock-Seeger. I'm the Vice President of Strategy at Lightstar Renewables. We are a community solar developer that specializes in agrivoltaic design of our projects. And we are so happy to be here. I am very happy to be working in New York. I am native of Manlius, New York, so a little further north in the Hudson Valley, but really appreciate having been ag adjacent my whole life and having best friends that were dairy farmers. So I just want to thank everybody for coming and thank Kate for putting this together, and Brown, who is a board member of Montgomery, has also joined, I think, as well. And we really appreciate the partnership that we've developed with the town and the community members there on trying to actually make this work. And so I really wanted to highlight, where do we start, right? Like, how do, as municipal leaders and developers engaging each other, where do we start? How do we build trust? And what does this actually look like? We went over the definition of agrivoltaics. There is definitely some clarification that I think, stakeholders, our partners with AFT and Ian Solag, we're going to be developing over the next few months and years to come. We are proud to be leaders in this movement. So, but we definitely encourage municipalities to consider the state definition for agricultural production, agricultural and horticultural production. It already exists, so you can hold people to that standard and make sure that they're producing the correct amounts and crops on the property. Also, I'm going to go back to this because it's very important. Ensuring a project remains in agricultural production. We're not here to pull the wool over people's eyes. No pun intended. There's also something that we suggest is that a farm logistics plan be submitted as a part of site plan approval. It's extremely important so that everybody's on the same page about what the history of the land is, history from the farmer and the farm manager, and that the town feels comfortable with the support, management support that the farmer has. We also need clear construction guidelines. New York State does have excellent ones. Ethan had pointed that out. And so I always point that to those towns. They're very easy to follow, but very robust and makes a lot of sense. And developers are comfortable with them. And so towns should feel comfortable as well. Decommissioning of projects, it's very important. That's an industry standard, especially for our sized projects, which are just up to 5 megawatts, about 20 to 40 acres. But also to be considering, if you want to be, you need to be farm centered when you're considering, because there could be some materials that might be useful to the farmer afterwards. And there could be, structures that could be used for tunneling or things like that. So just make sure that you allow that flexibility for farmers when you're considering that. Agricultural fencing is also very important. It keeps animals away from crops and can increase crop yield just because of that. So we're very excited about that added benefit. And then considering setbacks, and Ian already addressed that about making sure that we're maximizing the area for the agricultural operation. Just flew through those because I know I'm cognizant of everybody's time tonight, but I did want to highlight the compliance measures. This is probably the second question that we get. The first question is, well, what grows? And the answer to that is a lot. There's a lot of beneficial benefits to the arrays for both the panels and the crops, depending on which ones they are. There's lots of research that has come out recently, just this year. But we do, the second one is always, well, how are we going to ensure that it remains production? The easiest thing when you don't have an incentive at the state level as a financial mechanism or lever to pull is utilizing the tax assessment process or something similar. In New York State, it's actually quite easy. The requirement for enrolling in the farmland tax assessment is you need to meet at least $10,000. The definition of agricultural production, livestock and livestock products, but then you also need to really meet $10,000 revenue requirement from anything that's produced off that land, and it cannot be solar, stipend, or lease payments. So we think that's a great threshold. It is financially meaningful to penalties to a developer, but it's also a great way for municipalities to feel to kind of alleviate any kind of administrative burden that may come up in terms of ensuring compliance. We definitely encourage cure periods because farming is still farming, and extreme weather, crop failure, drought, and other agricultural challenges. So we definitely ask for those increases. So we are really serious about compliance because it cuts both ways for us as well. The farmer stipend is very important for us because that is the formalizing of a contract between us and the farmer to ensure that they're staying, remaining in production on the land. And also it's a farm viability issue. We are sole developers, but we have a deep admiration and respect for farming families. And so this is a way to ensure that they get over kind of the hump of the learning curve of a new way of farming, and also to make sure it's a meaningful practice for them. So stipends are really important, and it can be also used as a lever to ensure that it remains in production. So I mentioned the tax assessment tool. I am hopeful. There is a Senate bill currently filed by Michelle Hinchy, neighboring and in the Hudson Valley as well. So for agrivoltaics projects to be able to retain their tax assessment. We have worked with Ian and Ethan and a number of other folks across the country in 6 other states on measures like this. In New Jersey and Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Maryland currently have this on the books, and it makes it much easier for a compliance mechanism for towns and states to ensure land stays in production. So I think that this is the crux of any good agrivoltaics program because it's a way to assure trust. And so I definitely encourage you to reach out to Senator Hinchy's office, and feel free to reach out to me as well if you want to get involved to help push this, because I do believe it is a really easy and robust way to ensure compliance. We already went over American Farmland Trust Solar Smart Guidelines. We love it. All of our projects are going to meet those guidelines. We're really proud of that. We also follow the 5 Cs from NREL. It's an incredible, it just came out in August. And prior to that, the guidelines that folks in the industry had to look to, the closest thing was in Germany in the Fraunhofer Institute for Sustainable Energy. The guidelines are very good, but I think that the NREL 5 Cs are really more American farming oriented, and takes into consideration the large scale goals that we have, especially. So definitely encourage you all to get familiar with those. Just wanted to display how important or how widespread the support for this is, and where this is the tip of the spear here at municipalities. I do think that municipal leaders are at the forefront of ag preservation and climate change, and agrivoltaics is a way for you all to be able to do both. And so you're not alone. You don't have to be the first, and you are definitely supported in doing that. So DOE, USDA, Cornell, AFT as examples here. We actually are involved in a DOE grant with American Farmland Trust and SolAg, our New York and Illinois agrivoltaic sites. So stay tuned for hopefully a good announcement starting in December about that. But where there's going to be, and it's going to be real-time research. We're not waiting. We want to disseminate the information to people as soon as possible. I personally am not interested in academic journals. I just want to talk to people about what's working, what's not. That's how farmers generally hand down information to people. It's farmer to farmer, it's person to person. I think that's how we're going to get this adopted in a widespread manner. I'm also losing my voice. What's going on here? So, and also you're not alone in terms of states. There's a number of folks, and I believe Duncan from Colorado is on this on the webinar tonight too. And coalition is forming to start to discuss legislation for agrivoltaic incentives. Jack Solar Garden is the first largest commercially operating agrivoltaic array in the country right now, and they're doing really well. And so we want to replicate that in New York and across the country, and Colorado is recognizing that effort as well. Stay tuned about the Farm Bill. I think people are really interested in how we can support farmers to adopt practices like this. So conversations are just starting, but I'm hopeful that we can it can help support farmers through the Farm Bill. So with that, I will stop talking. Any questions on how policy and how everybody can get involved? I'm happy to chat and disseminate my contact information. And get over to Cami. She is on the front line. She is the project manager for our Montgomery site, and I'm really proud of Cami. She's worked so hard with our landowners and our farmers and everybody involved in Montgomery to try to help them understand what works best for Montgomery and how we can all work together to make agrivoltaics happen at the community level.
Yes, thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Kate, and everyone for attending this webinar. So I'm going to take it down to the very local level and introduce you all to a project that Lightstar has been looking at. This project is located in the town of Montgomery. It is an agrivoltaic solar project located on prime farmland or class 1 NRCS soils. This project is in that community scale range of about 3.5 megawatts DC. New York State does have a max limit of 5 megawatts AC for community solar projects. But every solar developer is at the end of the day at the mercy of the interconnecting utility and how much we can actually inject into the distribution system. So when we went for interconnection review with Central Hudson, they came back with 2.5 megawatts AC. So that's why you kind of see this smaller system size of 3.5 megawatts DC. And it happens to fit very well with the 16 acres of farmland that the DiMartino family has made available for this project. So this will be a single axis tracker. The maximum height will be around 14 feet, not 6.5 feet. Sorry for not correcting that. This will have a configuration of 2 panels in portrait, given that we want to kind of maximize the amount of solar density that we can fit within this property while still spacing the rows significantly apart in order to allow for efficient agricultural operations co-located with the array. The DiMartino family has been farming the site since 1972, and they're very excited about the prospect of having the opportunity to continue to farm and also receive lease payments and stipend payments to continue to farm the project underneath the solar arrays. So that's what I'll say about this project. You can see there's a nice rendering here. So we call this solar noon when the single axis trackers have kind of tracked all the way flat. And the distance between panels at this time, which is the time when the arrays are closest together, is always going to have 16 feet of open sky, as Ian likes to say. So plenty of room for a standard tractor to traverse the arrays, but they could also do so when the arrays are at an angle and there's even more space for that operation to continue. You can go to the next slide, Lucy. So this is just another rendering that we had done using realistic photo simulations to kind of show what the project can look like once it is enacted and built. And again, just mentioning that this project has been, submitted as a potential grant awardee to the DOE grant that Lucy and so many others are working diligently on. You can go to the next slide. So, in early conversations with the planning board in the town of Montgomery, they did want to ensure that the project would still be adequately screened from public view. And so we put together this rendering showing the different landscaping plans that will be enacted along the most public facing side of the project or the front property line. So we don't plan to, cut any corners by saying that the fence line can go all the way to the property line. we're still going to be maintaining landscaping and all the other zoning requirements that exist in the town's code. So you can go to the next slide, Lucy. So I just want to go ahead and commend the town of Montgomery. So the town of Montgomery came out with a 2020 comprehensive plan. And within that comprehensive plan, they had a recommendation to reconsider the prohibition of solar panel installation on prime agricultural soils. So that prohibition, which is in the town of Montgomery zoning code, really was, inhibiting the town from looking at developing agrivoltaic projects. And so that recommendation allowed the town to revisit their zoning laws and see if there was ways that they could relax the prohibition and allow for agrivoltaics. So some of the proposed amendments that the town has been considering, which would really enable an efficient agricultural operation co-located with renewable energy production, are detailed in the next 2 slides. So I've just highlighted what those high-level changes are. First off is just adding a definition for agrivoltaics so that it can be referred to in the body of the document. And I will go ahead and define that for you since others have done a great job of that tonight. The second is to allow agrivoltaic solar on NRCS Class 1 and Class 2 soils, since the land will still be utilized for agricultural purposes. So this would enable us and the town to efficiently, develop these sorts of projects. The third one, which Lucy touched on briefly, which is super important, is the submission of a farm plan. So the farm plan would detail all the different mechanisms that are in place to incentivize the developer and the asset owner and the farmer to continue to farm the site while it is under lease with the solar development company. And we plan to work with qualified experts and Ian and his company to put together this farm plan, also to work with the DiMartino family and other interested farmers to make sure that the planning board and other reviewers who will ultimately provide permits on this project feel secure that we will continue to farm this project. So that is definitely going to be a requirement of the site plan approval and the conditional use permit. You go to the next slide, please, Lucy. And then 4 more that, might be specific to Montgomery, but are important for other municipalities to consider if they have similar restrictions in their zoning code. So Montgomery did have a lot coverage restriction whereby a small or, not a large percentage of the parcel could be required for solar. But since the panels are spaced farther apart, and since we need more space from the panels to the fence to allow for a tractor to traverse the property efficiently, we do need more land coverage. Therefore, relaxing lot coverage restrictions is very beneficial to agrivoltaics so that solar developers can still site an economic amount of panels on the property, and so that we can ensure that there's enough space to do both renewable energy generation and agricultural production on the same parcel. Kind of along the same lines, if municipalities have restrictions on the amount of acres that can be allowed for solar, well, again, increasing that, since we do need more space for these projects, even if you might not be increasing the actual system size of the solar, is very beneficial, since we do need larger spacing between the rows and more space from the panels to the fence line. And then thinking about the actual fence that will surround the property, I have heard that many farmers are excited about having a fence to keep out wildlife. So just understanding if the towns have restrictions on the fence height, potentially allowing that fence height to go taller to keep out deer and other animals that might be able to hop the fence to protect the crops. And also, if there is a requirement for fences to have adequate wildlife openings, not requiring that for specifically agrivoltaic projects, so that animals that would get in and eat the crops are actually efficiently kept out of the farmed area. So these are some of the proposed amendments that the town is proposing, and that Lightstar and other farming consultants feel would be a great way to most efficiently maximize both renewable and agricultural production on the same parcel. So yes, that's what I have. Go ahead. Yes, Thank you. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap.
Thanks so much. That's fantastic. Excellent. We have quite a few questions. Some of them have been answered, but I guess it's worth maybe still reviewing them if the panelists agree to make sure we answer them for the person in full. And I suppose the first one is, does the shading from panels impact growth of plants underneath the panels? You know, some of you made reference to it, but maybe you want to elaborate on maybe that question.
I can take that. You know, there's a misnomer that shade kills, and in actuality, shade can benefit certain crops. And the panels are in their nature, where UMass is going and where Cornell is going is they're studying the photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. And PAR is what is really important, because plants can shut down at photosynthesis in the middle of the day, in the heat of the day. But if there's a little bit of shade, they actually do continue to photosynthesize at the levels that are optimal. So that's where there's PAR sensors being put on quite a few of these arrays, and we'll have a whole lot more data in the next 3 to 5 years about that.
Great, thank you. And again, some are more shade loving. I think from those pictures, which were phenomenal, that you're getting a lot in, we're tilting. So I was intrigued by Lucy talking about the tomatoes, because I was under the impression they always loved heat, and one would think sun. But I think all plants stress out by the end of the day. So I see what she's saying, and it does make a lot of sense. Okay, so Ethan presented something there. So the panels are black. How does this impact the vegetation? Steve would like to know. Also, how does one address the change in rainfall patterns on the ground? In other words, the runoff from the panels may lead to erosion. I know sometimes we've seen some gutters used so that it's not dripping right there, and perhaps used in reservoirs to water or irrigate at another time. Does anyone want to take this question?
I can jump on that real quick again. Yes, we're not quite there to the point of working with financial institutions to be able to really manipulate the solar panels themselves. That might be something that happens in the future. But the way things with single axis trackers, which is really where things are going in the future, it doesn't rain the same time every day. So by definition, the rainwater is going to be dispersed more. And actually in Massachusetts, the Department of Environmental Protection ruled that it doesn't have any adverse impacts from a wetland functioning perspective, the amount of water that comes down with a single axis tracker kind of array. So it is more, there are efficiencies that can be gained from collecting water. Better regenerative practices means that water won't get run off. It'll be kept on the farm, which is where the future is.
Yeah, and I can add on to that a couple of things. One is that bifacial solar panels or solar modules are, becoming kind of the standard due to the fact that they're not really more expensive than standard solar panels, and they enable something like 5 to 10% additional energy generation, because they have different type of technology and spaces between the cells on the panels, so that light can actually pass through the panel and then be reflected off the ground and absorbed on the back. So you kind of get energy on the front and on the back because you have some spacing between the cells. So not the entire front of the cell is actually black. The other thing I'll say is, at least for the racking providers that we're working with, we're going to have spacing in between each individual module of, I believe it's 3 or 30 centimeters. I'll have to check. I know that's a big difference. That's also to allow efficient backside gain with these modules. But if you can imagine, you're going to have water trickling in between every single panel, which is about 1 meter in width. So you're not going to have all of this rain coming down and not trickling down and falling in a waterfall. And then you might have already said this, Ian, but as the panels track throughout the day, you're going to have water dispersing onto the ground in different directions. And it's not just going to be a sheet of rain coming on one angle, which you would have on a fixed tilt array. So that should help with, you know, water not eroding in one place, rather trickling in a more dispersed fashion.
Now, I remember where I saw the gutter most recently, and it is on the parking lot canopy applications. So, and rightfully so, with the snow melt coming down, and even with the rain in a parking lot, it makes sense. So I don't know if it would be necessary in some applications for farmers, but the technology is there. Now, here's the big one. The ORIS, if folks are looking at the chat, is the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. This is in New York State, and this is a relatively new department that is in charge of all of these big, very big solar applications. So David's asking about that department's unreasonable burdensome authority, and that it runs contrary to the concept of home rule, which is something for everyone's edification is New York based, where the little villages and towns say what is going to happen and they dictate any code zoning. It is up to them, and the state usually cannot tell them otherwise. And I think that Haley may have answered some of David's concerns, because under New York State Article 10, there are some, again, common good public utility exceptions. So David wants to know how communities are being forced to live with unwanted projects, even if they object. Haley, do you want to discuss that, even though I know you alluded to it could be a whole new webinar of its own?
Oh, it could be. And I can cover it quickly. And as I said in the chat, I just want to be clear, because I think sometimes there's a perception, and it seems like David is well aware of this, but I think some folks aren't, that the existing New York State Public Service Law, Article 10, which has been in place in one form or another since the 1980s, and governs permitting of traditional energy generation facilities. So your gas power plant, your coal power plant, those are permitted under Article 10, and it includes really identical unreasonably burdensome language, which means that if the authority decides that the local zoning is unreasonably burdensome, then the project need not comply, and that's a decision that is ultimately made at the state level and taken out of the hands of local government. And you can see why that's sometimes unpopular with local government folks. It certainly, you can intuitively understand that. And I'll just say that the policy judgment by the state, first when they enacted Article 10 in the early 1980s, and continuing through the Accelerated Renewable Energy Benefit Act, which is what created the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES, the policy judgment by the state was that, and I'm talking back to Article 10 in the 80s, was that nobody wants a power plant in their town. They say, put it in the next town over, just put it over there. I don't want it here in my community, put it in a different community. And every single community says that. But these power plants, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's gas, do not just supply power to, when you're talking about, again, we're talking about the larger projects. The smaller ones are still governed by local approvals. The big ones, they power the whole state, whole regions of the state. These electrons don't stay in the local community. So the need is not based on the need for the local community, but it's much broader. So the policy judgment that the legislature made was that it wanted to take some of that home rule away, because there was a deep concern that everyone would just say no, and we would end up with an energy crisis in terms of originally when Article 10 was enacted, and in terms of the application today with ORES, that we would never reach our renewable energy goals. And I'll just say that personally, being someone who is often out in the community, talking to local government, talking to community groups, this is something we see a lot. I mean, if I had a dime for every time I heard, I love solar energy, I just don't want it in my town, it's something that we hear every day. And so there is some sort of rational basis, but of course, folks' kind of policy values can differ in terms of whether it should remain with local government versus the state.
I think that's a fantastic explanation. And you reminded me that you could also apply that to landfills. Landfills used to be smaller and more numerous, and no community wants a new landfill. And now we have very few. We have one last remaining one, Seneca Meadows in upstate New York. And when that closes, I remind municipalities, This is why I just had my 2 webinars on food scraps and extended producer responsibility, because once that closes, no one wants a new one, and it's not going to get, and may have to take an act of the state to do this. So thank you for making me think of that parallel. The next big one we have is the interconnection issue. Marty is reminding us that utilities, our grid, we have limitations. This is big. Would anyone like to discuss our New York grid and the limitations and the problems we're going to have? The example that Cami just gave, okay, they can go up to 5 megawatts AC as per New York State, each individual project, but they're limited because of the utility, the host, the phase 3, the third, phase wire.
Phase 3, you got it.
Yep, thank you. I usually move it phase 3. So what do we do about this? And, I appreciate, I think, Lucy, you had said it's going to take them a few years. And we don't really have a few years if we have all these goals and targets and objectives. And if we're spending all of our, I'm going a little further with the IRA money and a few other pots of money, shouldn't we be directing it there first and foremost?
Yeah, so I will say there is a grid mod docket open right now. And if there are municipal and nonprofit leaders on this call, I highly recommend you submit comments so that you let them know that we need capacity and there needs to be a fair share of interconnection points across the region. And they need to hear from you. They actually did say that they needed to hear from local leaders about this. And you don't need to be a technical person to submit comments. You just have to let them know that you care. They did say when they opened up the docket and the stakeholder process that it was going to take about 18 to 24 months to plan and then install everything. I sent that to our engineers and he laughed, our chief engineer laughed, because the supply chain will absolutely impact that. And there's major labor shortages as well. So it's good and we're going with it because we like that timeline. But I think it will probably take longer, but I will code it with a little more rose coloredness here. I think the IRA will actually help loosen that timeline as well, because there's, as someone who just came from the largest national solar conference, everybody is ramping up American made. And I think that you will see, yeah, Kate, I see you.
Finally.
So everybody's talking about it and it's for real. Nobody's naysaying. So that's a really good thing. And I think that may alleviate some of the supply chain issues with the equipment that would be needed for upgrades. So, the solar industry is working hand in hand with the administration and the Public Service Commission to do those plans. So, but we definitely need local support to help push that, because they need to hear from you, not just us. We're there all the time. They don't care.
Right. And with so many issues, that's the case. They need to hear from local leaders, especially extended producer responsibility. But hey, can you put that in the chat, Lucy, so that the local leaders and certainly email me that as well, what should be done, and maybe we'll do some follow-up outreach to them. And yes, rose-colored glasses is the way we go in government a lot of times. You gotta stay positive.
Same thing in solar, because if you looked at it all at once, you would be bricked. So
that's right.
Can I answer one question? Because I actually think it's very important. It is nitty gritty, but I really appreciated it from Judy, who also shouted out Jake Marley from Hyperion Systems, who I think is on here too. So shout out to Jake, good industry friend of ours and a trailblazer in agrivoltaics in Massachusetts, him and his family. So so she mentions that the Jack Solar Garden, who we're touting as kind of a model for standardization of array design, he is the owner operator of his array, Byron, who actually consulted on our Montgomery bylaw proposal. We said, what did you need to do to change the ordinances in Boulder County? What do you think we need to do to change, and how can we help the town and give them choices for what they need and can match their values? So huge shout out to Byron at Jax. So he owns it, and it's hard. It's a community solar array. So that means that Jax and him, they have off takers and they have to manage that. And, we're a third party community solar developer. And just because we put it in the ground, we subscribe it with people, doesn't mean our hands are done. And we have to do battle with the utilities to make sure that our customers are protected, consumers are protected, and the utilities are billing people the right amount, on time, and clean up any issues that we have in between. And Byron's doing all of that by himself. We hire an external third-party subscriber management firm to do that. As a whole industry to do that. So it is for community solar, it's hard, community solar scale. It's hard for farmers to administer them themselves, not to mention insurance and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a difficult model to prove that way. Not to say it's impossible, but I'll give a real life example. In New Jersey, there was on-farm in 2010 backlash from the first SREC program. They decided to essentially prohibit ground-mounted solar on greenfield development in New Jersey, except for if it was up to 2 megawatts and on 10 acres of land. Back then, by the efficiencies of panels, that essentially shut down everything. It didn't exist. You couldn't do that. You could barely do like a megawatt on 10 acres. So first of all, developers didn't want to do that. And then also in the bill, it required that the farmers to own the array after the lease was over. So the Farm Bureau, New Jersey Farm Bureau, that pushed for this legislation, they wanted it. This was their big push for farm viability. They asked their members, oh, it's 10 years in. Why does nobody want to take advantage of this program? And they all said, because of the ownership at the end of the lease requirement. So that was a huge piece of feedback that we were missing. And so then another reason was because then also developers didn't want people to own the arrays as well, because insurance and upkeep and O&M, because when you own the arrays, then when something breaks, then you're on the hook for that. And so you have to figure out how to fix that or connect with somebody. But you go through a developer and you lease it on your land, there's a steady income there, and then you don't have to worry about the O&M of the project or yield loss or anything like that. So it's just another asset for farmers that they don't necessarily want to own. But there are smaller arrays. There are installers that do ground-mounted agricultural arrays in all of the Northeast states right now. Could they be agrivoltaics? I think so. So just to kind of, our sweet spot is community solar up to 5 megawatts. So, but there are definitely smaller folks who would be interested in owning their own panels in their array. Spoke to somebody just the other day about this in Massachusetts. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's a really, really great question, because we want farmers and communities to build wealth by owning their projects. We're seeing this in the low and moderate income sector as well. For example, in Illinois, they really wanted to build wealth by, at the end of the lease option, then the community would own the array. But then when we went to go finance it and purchase insurance, it just didn't make sense financially and long-term for the community. So it's a great idea. It's just we haven't gotten over the hump of how do we operate this at a community level or a farmer level, so it's not super burdensome.
And Lucy, I don't know if you said in the beginning and I missed it, but then there's the decommissioning fee. So if they do own it, they're going to have to be responsible. And, it will get another 10 years at least. It will still be efficient, probably even after 40 years, it will still generate. But they're still responsible for the recycling, the removal, and the taking away of all of that product.
Right. So smaller arrays, for sure, like backyard, 700 kilowatt, whatever, 500 kilowatt, that would be great. I think that's probably something to look into and understand, but is that at scale? Like that's kind of behind the meter on-site load stuff, but needing in order to meet our larger goals, like scaling that up will be important. So it's a great conversation. So thanks for that question, Judy.
Great. And now back to my favorite. Will the forthcoming cattle grazing project be located? Where will it be located? I heard, I think Ethan, you may have brought it up. I don't know of any in Orange County, but I've again asking for it for so long. You know, we were very big in dairy, and now we're not. And like Ethan said, all the farms are being replaced with different things, but there are, at least we're close enough to the city that we do have young farmers interested in taking over our farms. So the real problem with, I mean, again, I don't want to go further down a rabbit hole, but the real problem is there's not a slaughterhouse nearby. But it would be nice to have that option. So do we know, Ethan, where that was? Because we could, again, only have so much sheep.
The project that was highlighted was the Grafton, Massachusetts project. And I put a link into the chat that provides a bit more detail on the research that's happening on that site.
Okay.
And Ian is actually the
Okay.
consultant on that site as well. Be there through the life of the project, supporting farmer on that. So
The kind of the key innovation there is to manage the trackers so that you don't have an animal panel interface. In other words, they're not. You're always got flat panels when the cattle are underneath, and you can do that with collars, GPS collars in the animals. There's some large scale examples of that in the Southeast that are being deployed. And they're not using special racking. They're using, basically market ready racking that's 7.5 feet off the ground. The key innovation is managing the tilt to avoid the animals. And there's some real potential there.
yes, stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have a couple in the Hudson Valley. So we'll stay tuned for that for sure.
And that was also applicable to commodity crops as well, being a dairy state, or soy, hay, corn even can be grown if the algorithms on how those panels is manipulated, right, to allow for harvesting at particular times and the growing season. So that is being explored as well.
And also, I believe, Ian, it was your presentation where you really showed, I don't know, I want to call it like a stage, a theater stage. You showed an assembly I hadn't seen before, straight across, flat, with a full open area underneath. So that made it much easier to get to if you just raise the whole thing up flat. I thought that was a different layout. So that could make it compatible to a few other opportunities, things we're not even thinking of yet, right? All right, David is asking Ian, so this sounds very appealing and he supports the initiative. However, how many proposed solar projects subscribe to agrivoltaics, and how can we amend the CLCPA to incorporate these principles into the approval and licensing process?
So I'd kick that over to you, Kate.
I think that Ethan gave a great answer in terms of how what's being done and how we can continue to try to incentivize and drive these kinds of projects. I don't think it requires an amendment of the law, but as Ethan said, names are too similar. AFT, Scenic Hudson, and several other organizations filed a comment to the CLCPA Climate Action Council on their scoping plan with a series of recommendations aimed at trying to incentivize this kind of development. And there is a lot happening on that. I don't think it necessarily requires revision of the law, but kind of internal guidance and policies and practices by both NYSERDA and the permitting agency, I think are going to be really important. And I think, actually, I will just say that, David, I think the quote that you gave later on in the chat, for anyone that's following the chat, from Ag and Markets, which I believe was from like a brief in one of the cases. I think it was an Article 10 case. I mean, I think that demonstrates kind of the old attitude towards solar on ag, and that project was not an agrivoltaics project that Ag and Markets was talking about. It was a traditional old school solar project that happened to be at least partially on ag land. I don't remember the specifics of the project. But people are just starting to learn and embrace that you can really have that dual use, and you can have those benefits of both actually farming the land, getting those crops, allowing grazing, whatever it may be, along with the solar panels. So I hope that our policy in New York State comes along as this is becoming more and more of a thing. And Ethan also posted a link to the agricultural scorecard that NYSERDA has developed for projects that also incorporates kind of the same values and principles that we've been talking about here.
Right, and to New York's credit, we are learning as we go. They're constantly updating and changing, so I'm very optimistic. Logan asked, what can farmers expect to get paid per acre per year for allowing solar onto their land? Is it competitive with current ag leasing cost?
I can take this one, or Ian, you can help follow up too. It is competitive. We usually take into consideration what the market rate for, there's 2 points to this. There's the lease payments to the landowner for hosting the array. And then sometimes landowner is not the farmer, right? They're the landowner and they have a lessee. And so then we have the stipend in our business model that goes to the farmer, whoever it may be. So it may be actually 2 separate people. So the lease agreements, yes, they are competitive with ag lease rates. And I will admittedly say outpacing ag acreage as well, which is one of the reasons why Lightstar feels compelled to address farmland availability, because standard solar is pricing out farmers from open land, and that's absolutely a criticism that the industry needs to take on. And agrivoltaics is one answer to that. So to address the other issues, the stipend, it's based on whatever the market rate is for, and is a compelling number for to remain on the land and help, make sure that it's something that is meaningful to them financially, right? And I don't know if you can just give a little background of how we make those kinds of.
Sure, and I think this is the dynamic that that's upon us, right? Is you could probably do 70% cookie cutter, but the rest of this is really site specific. If you look at the soils, right, it's easy to, from an armchair, say, yeah, well, let's do this. But if you're really going to do this and do it successfully, you want to walk the land, right? Make a decision after you've experienced from the farmer's perspective what they've grown in the past, what they want to grow in the future. And so any incentive is paid based upon, what that farmer wants to do, right? Maybe it's a piece of equipment that is desirable that could be used for that particular under the array and other ways. And then in lieu of a stipend. The stipend, the idea there, and this is what influences the cost, is that, the landowner is going to get paid from a lease perspective. And that's great. That's a one-time thing that landowner gets. What about 15 years from now, 10, 15, 20 years from now? If there's a stipend that's reasonable, that may have an escalator built in, or it's based upon crops that are grown in that land and that community, then it's a reasonable presumption that the next generation in 15, 20 years will also have some incentive to be there and to farm under these arrays. So it's a long-winded way of saying there's no cookie cutter way as of yet. There may be something that is assigned based upon ranking criteria with the state, but left to our own devices right now, it's site specific, and what's it going to take to get accomplished what we want to accomplish, which helps the farm, the family, and the community.
Great, thank you. David also suggested, Logan, he would refer you to CADE. I do not know what this acronym is. Anyone know this? Or maybe David, if no one knows it, maybe you could spell it out in the chat. Okay. Next, Jeffrey Scales wants to know, why isn't anyone from the New York Green Bank here? So, I think we had a lot of people when we were making it. It became more of, okay, this is the next trend. I've been here long enough that I've seen a lot of different trends, and I always try and get out in front of it. And I think that we clearly got some wonderful speakers here. I guess I would say, I'm not sure if the Green Bank is necessary right now where we are. We know we have one project in the county proposed. And we could always, that doesn't mean we can't have another opportunity to have another webinar with them. So if my speakers want to mull this over and think about what is part two, what should we do next? What did we not cover tonight? What's the next step? We'll make sure we have the Green Bank at the next one. Anyone want to say anything about that?
I think that, this kind of goes hand in hand with, I think there was an incentive question too. So we know, closer to the NYSERDA conversation than us. I think that NYSERDA really wanted it to be farm focused and agricultural focused. So there's a couple of developers there, but we do know that NYSERDA is interested in incentive for agrivoltaics. I think they, Lightstar and another industry colleague submitted comments pretty much on every single stakeholder process about how there should be an incentive. I'll just really small story. NYSERDA went from the previous order, they had one paragraph of agricultural impact, and they had deemed that there was no agricultural impact from the community distributed generation. And I sent that immediately to American Farmland Trust and Ethan, and we both raised big eyebrows about that because we know that's not true. So they heard a earful about that. And so this last order, the 10 gigawatt roadmap order, they did a better job. There's 2 paragraphs on agricultural siting, and they basically said that they will follow the lead of the agricultural working group and whatever they propose, and they do support agrivoltaics incentives. And so we don't know what that would look like. They do things on a budget manner, so it is possible. Like I don't believe we'll need legislation in this state for that, which is actually kudos to New York on that. So we'll definitely, we're tracking it, we're pushing it. I think that I'll plug Senator Hinchy's legislation again, because I think that's an important part of any incentive program, to make sure that it's not administratively burdensome, but it is definitely a high bar for entry. So anyway, so yes, I think that funders and policymakers can be maybe a next audience, and dig into what an incentive program might look like. But I'll say it again, I think municipal leaders are on the forefront of this, and they can lead and they can do it without the state. And Lightstar is dead set on making sure that agrivoltaics is competitive and at cost with standard community solar arrays. That's our big deal. And so we think we're making that happen in New York, so that there is no longer any excuse for anybody to not do some sort of agrivoltaics or dual use on their arrays. So I think we're heading in that direction, but yes, definitely need the funders.
Lucy, I just want to reinforce your point. The voice of local government in helping to move NYSERDA both to really think about this and to put market mechanisms in place sooner than later. They've been talking about this for a while, but really to do that. And the state ag and markets. We need some real evolution in the department there. And I think that's where hearing from local chapters of the Farm Bureau, local ag district leaders, and others, really, and county government, really important that ag and markets is hearing that this is an area for support from the department. There's work to be done to bring both of those agencies into more alignment here.
Agreed.
Right, and the local municipalities submit certain developments in New York State to the counties, and that was what I was instrumental in saying to all of them, that you had no decommissioning language, and that was 10, 12 years ago now. It is another example of how local communities are ill-prepared. These are overworked, understaffed municipalities that do not have a lot of knowledge on these cutting-edge topics. So decommissioning was essential, and we got them all eventually to do that. I can go into my question now and say, that's where they had to put in moratorium to stop and say, we need, slow your roll here. We need to concentrate on this decommissioning, setbacks, etc. So they did that, and that was constant. That was a lot of years of moratorium. The more they got hit and sidelined, and they just knew they had to do this. Unfortunately, a lot of times it was too late. But now we're dealing with it, and now there's new moratoria because they are realizing things we've talked about today. They have silly setbacks. They have silly height restrictions, things that now are always being refined, and we'll see more of that. And one of the things that is the height of the height of the fence. And that's something with the wildlife crossings that I've worked hard to also drive home and educate the municipalities how important this is. And I think it was Lucy or Cami who talked about this. First of all, their project came to our office a few months ago, and it was the only one that I ever saw an attractive fence. And I don't know, maybe it is me, but an agricultural fence is much more attractive than a cyclone fence. They went higher, but that was okay because it was attractive. We can put bat boxes on the wood post. We can make this work. We're still doing vegetation screening, and that's great. But the wildlife crossing is something that I am a land use planner. I look at things all objectively. If we are taking out all the animals, we're putting them somewhere, and we're burdening the surrounding neighbors, whether they're residential, business. We're putting the animals at risk, at jeopardy. Without a wildlife corridor, we do not have some place for our animals to safely go. But should we direct them away from, 50 acres to this one little corridor? What is the answer to that? Anyone? Can we come up with something?
Nature Conservancy has great maps on that. So, I mean, we think about this. I don't have a huge answer for you, Kate, but we think about this all the time too. And, but, what I did mention that, we have definitely farmers want wildlife to remain away from their crops. So that's why we have a little taller. But I mean, we hear you on the other wildlife corridors, and I do think that the Nature Conservancy is doing an awesome job in trying to piece those together, and habitat connectivity is definitely a big piece of that conversation. Oh,
Right,
and
and
Kristen, did Kristen say she wants to answer that?
I didn't see that because I'm trying to stay organized. We got a lot of questions, and I did want to go back. I thought we talked about, right now farms are completely open. So the fence is helping bring down a lot of wildlife critters that would come in and eat the farmers' produce. So maybe if we still had the wildlife crossing for the smaller ones, that could be something. The larger ones are the ones that cause, serious major car accidents though on the roads and make it unsafe. So this is something that we need to work through, like with everything, like we've talked about, all the different trends we see in land use and the way that, cell phone towers, et cetera, the things that just keep coming in that we have to address. But I will say Ag and Market was, again, probably 8-10 years ago, where a farmer stood up and said, I'm growing tomatoes. What's the difference if I'm growing electric? So Ag and Market still has to refine their approach and come and really think about how to do it differently. Like I know a bunch of us have just said. Did you say Kristen was there?
Yes, yep. I think you have to unmute her. Oh, there she is. Good.
So I have been pretty quiet because we have not passed our solar law yet that has included the agrivoltaics. We're still very much actively working on it. But one important thing that you just brought up about the wildlife corridor, I brought up in the last meeting, and I was like, you can't really have a wildlife corridor even for smaller animals and allow the foxes in with the chickens. So, you really have to decide what kind of farming you're going to do. And if it's any type of livestock, you really got to protect them. And I'm pretty sensitive to that with my own farm here. So an interesting part that I discussed with our town board was that, we did not allow for the full parcel to be developed. So the excess land that's also on the parcel could be used for like a wildlife, accepting that the wildlife is going to be excluded from the solar array. Might be more of a wildlife sanctuary area for them to congregate. You know, farmers, we're wildlife experts most days. So we don't want them to leave, but we also don't want to push them off on our neighbors. So by having that area that's not fully developed into solar arrays, whether it's agrivoltaics, community, or utility, does allow that wildlife area to flourish.
Right, right. Thank you. That's great. Did you want to mention anything else about the process while we have you on, or the status there?
Sure, it's been a wild ride. You know, I'm a farmer. I'm not a politician. I just said that I ran based on being a pissed off farmer. So I'm still working on all this policy stuff. But so in our town, the solar law was updated shortly before I came on board, and there was no agrivoltaics in it. It was very restrictive to the percentage of the parcel. There was no solar allowed on prime soils, USDA areas of statewide importance. Like it's very restrictive on solar arrays. So shortly after, you know, our town board was really told that it's too restrictive. So we tried to swing the pendulum the other way. At the same time, we were approached by John Capello of Jacobitz and Gubitz, who represents Lightstar and is actually a homeowner here in the town. He's very knowledgeable about solar, and I do appreciate his sentiment most of the time. So anyway, he brought forth the addition of agrivoltaics, and in addition, it was in part of our comprehensive plan, which I worked very hard on updating also. So it all meshed, right? We updated the comprehensive plan, then we updated the solar law. We are looking to get that passed relatively soon. There was, like I said, with the fencing, that was not a major change. It was a minor change that the board decided. So it's been a longer process than anticipated, but we look forward to the finished goal sometime soon. And hopefully my neighbors about 5 minutes away are the DiMartinos. They have a large farm just north of me. And I look forward to seeing it developed, because I really kind of hammered Lightstar pretty well on how farming would work. So I appreciate their time also. And if any other municipalities are looking at a solar law, they're welcome to contact me. And I'm happy to answer any questions offline.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for being the guinea pig, because we will be following in your footsteps. So we appreciate you beating up Lightstar for us. I also enjoyed meeting with them. So we had a good meeting. I think they thought it was going to be a little shorter. So I apologize for that. So, and Jimmy, the chat will be available. We hope I'll get that on the website as well. We'd like to know about the American panels. I think we talked about that. That's where it's going. Did we know of anything in particular? Someone's asking of a brand. I would like to know, because when I did the Solarize programs a few years ago, I could not get anything near America. We got American companies, but they all were somewhere else. We also had the old IBM, which was then the tech center, right? Help me there up in Ulster. They had some solar panels trying to be made there, but that went bust as well under Obama, I think. So that was that long ago. Do we know of anything being made in America now? Or very
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I was just gonna say, First Solar is based in the US. They make thin film solar panels, and their solar panels are used on huge utility scale projects, like hundreds of megawatts or even gigawatt size all over the country. They cater more towards utility scale, so we don't use them, but that is a company doing really well. My old company, Sun Power, also opened a factory in Oregon, and I think they separated into a manufacturing and a development company, but I think they might be looking into bolstering the Oregon factory as well. So those are just two that come to mind for me.
And just to add 2 cents, I think Rochester is getting the first solar recycling plant in New York State. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
Things are happening slowly
There's
but
also
surely.
chips for, arrays need chips as well. Like that's a huge, President Biden, his most recent legislation, which I think is very underrated, but very important. Our cars, our solar arrays, our phones, everything runs on these kinds of chips, and they're investing billions and billions of dollars into that. And that's really meaningful for us because that's yet another supply chain issue that we've been dealing with over the last 3 years. So we are seeing more, and I loved having the conversation with our chief technology officer after the conference last week. He is a very level engineer, another New York native from Buffalo. And he's dry most of the time. He was very excited about the American made kind of outlook for everything. And people thought that it was going to take a long time. It's no joke. The IRA is a real economic engine, and there was 26,000 people at this solar conference, and a lot of them were American made solar manufacturing companies, and they are going all in on trying to gear up for the gigawatts and gigawatts that are needed across the country over the next few years. So and we ride a very steep solar coaster most of the time. So when I have positive news, it's for real. So when your engineer is happy, it's real.
Did you say 26,000 people at the conference?
Yeah, it was nuts.
And more people didn't come away with COVID. Wow, incredible.
Yep. Well, we don't know. I'm not tracking them, but
right.
I think we
They
did
didn't
pretty
track
well.
that. And to your point with the whole chip thing, that was based in COVID, right? When we had our supply shortage. So we got something good out of it. That leads us to the end of our chat list. If anyone else has any questions or comments that they'd like to share, David would like to know if you could post the Lightstar solar plan. That should be on the town of Montgomery's. I'm assuming David means that particular.
Well, we haven't applied yet. So just so we're clear
Okay.
about what the process is, and Kristen just outlined it, that they had a comprehensive plan. They had to amend their bylaws. So they're amending their bylaws to allow for agrivoltaics. Once that happens, if it happens, which we have hope, then we will be able to submit a site application. So we don't have anything to publicly share with anybody right now, but as they do, we will share, and you'll be able to see it on the town website.
Okay, that's great. Does anyone have anything else to say? We're going to get busy figuring out part 2 with inviting the Green Bank, right? So I'll wrap that up then and thank everyone and remind you that it will be on our website. I put it in the chat, orangecountygov.com/sustainability. I thank the speakers. I thank everyone for attending, and you can reach out to any of us. Their contact information will be there as well. We look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night and a great weekend.
Thank you, Kate, so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Kate. Well done.
Ethan, what are you still doing here? I gave you permission to leave a while ago.
I'm out of here. Thank you so much. Really well done.
I really hope you feel better. Thank you so much for everything. It was wonderful.
Thanks.
All right, take care. It